Hello, and welcome to episode 93 of the following Mechanical Turks project. We've been sort of in the thick of looking at this third product, which we've been kind of developing and redeveloping quite a bit as we go. It's had to sort of collect all of these conversations we've been having throughout the course of this project. And, as we've been writing the other products, we've been thinking about, the weight that this last one has to bear. More recently, we've been kind of, thinking of it in its sort of theoretical operations, right? Because we want this to be a piece that doesn't just talk about theory, but enacts it in the way that we contend Mechanical Turk is enacting these other sorts of concepts we've been dealing with. So we've been sort of going back and forth over how do we do that. We've been talking about some experimental formal structures, having other folks be co-authors and maybe take on some of these things and kind of issue a sort of human intelligence task to our fellow scholars, in a way modeling what Mechanical Turk is doing. So we've been fortunate to have a lot of guests who've been really helpful to frame sort of those conversations and help us think about this topic as we work our way through it. We're fortunate to have another guest today. And I think I'm going to flip it over to you to introduce Antonio Byrd. We're going to take a look at his work and his thoughts on writing, particularly in networked environments, especially now that we've seen this wave of tools that is sort of voraciously scraping content and what that's going to mean for language and writing and ethics.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that Antonio's here. He's actually down the road from me in Kansas City at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And the piece that really I think that got us thinking in this direction, I think sort of early on, it sort of either consciously or unconsciously sort of laid the groundwork to this shift to thinking about the artifice itself. Was your piece I think it was the Comp Studies Forum on AI and writing, and the truth-telling piece about large language models, and in particular the move that you make towards the end, like in the last couple of paragraphs, sort of thinking about the idea that the writing that we do becomes part of the large language models that then, right, there's even a line, right, the activities help us answer the question, what truths do we write into public spheres for LLM audiences? I'm not suggesting writing about love and empathy, but rather telling the truth about bigotry. We find love and empathy with the force of activism. But thinking about activism actually as an always ongoing activity that then is sort of that large language models, as Jerry was talking about, right, sort of suck up, right? There's this idea that our sort of ongoing practices of literacy are shaping what the large language model might then end up producing. And that struck us as a really useful way and a really provocative way to think about activism, not as having something to say about what AI is or isn't, but actually thinking about the artifice in which that intelligence emerges, and that being the place where we do our work. And that's, I think, something that Jeremy and I have been kicking around for a while in lots of different contexts. I think one of my touchstones is a short story by Ted Chiang called The Life Cycle of Software Objects, where he essentially makes the argument that AI can't be built or programmed. It basically has to be raised. So if you want something to have the common sense of 20-year-old, it will take you 20 years to do it. And that, I think, fits in then with the kind of pedagogical work that you're doing, is actually thinking about how is our, almost unavoidable participation in this artifice shaping the kinds of intelligences that will emerge. Yeah, and so I thought maybe we'd ask you to talk a little bit more about your thinking around that piece, and then kind of jump into the sort of experimental thing that we've been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that piece was really interesting because it came out of some remarks that I gave at the annual conference for college composition and communication. And I remember writing up those remarks quite literally the night before because it was new territory, right? I was like, how do I write about, large language models? This is in 2023. And I ultimately had to remind myself, well, Antonio, you're a literacy studies scholar. So you should really be using your expertise. Do not try to be someone else who's completely different. Like lean into the things that you really know about literacy and writing from your own research and bringing that in. When I was asked to write this piece for composition studies, it was kind of like trying to really hone those ideas and transform it in thinking really about what are the implications for us as writers moving forward, knowing that these tools are going to be really eating up all of the content that we write online. And I couldn't help but think about how the initial iteration of large language models, it comes from our own history of writing, of the instructions that we've been giving students for decades.
Mhm.
Uh, the history of going back into the 60s and the 70s, where we're trying to rethink how do we actually teach students how to write when we see more marginalized students, more Black and Brown students with their different linguistic practices. And then suddenly running up against this back to basics movement, a kind of a literacy crisis is like, whoa, wait a minute. Like,
Mhm.
this is not what our students should be doing. They're not doing well on their tests. They're not writing in the way we expect them to do. They need to know that classic standard English in order to be successful. And I can't help but think that by the people who like develop these tools, they learned writing from somewhere. And you know, they're computer scientists, they're engineers. Someone taught them how to think about writing and language in a particular kind of way. And I couldn't help but think that we're partly part of that in composition, with that emphasis on standard English, and how that's kind of like transformed into the tools that we have. I think Carmen Kynard, she actually has a blog post where she makes this point, like you had an opportunity to really rethink language, but you didn't take that opportunity. And so she says that I am not upset about large language models because you're getting the very thing that you were really pressuring for a lot of students to be doing, right, over time. And so now there's like a bigger responsibility is what I was thinking about. Like there's the stakes are kind of higher now in thinking about what we actually put out into the world. Um, it's almost like we have to ask ourselves, how do I want to be extracted today?
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh,
Um, I
Wow.
I'm a big open access person. I finished writing my book manuscript. It's going through copy editing right now, but it's going to be open access. It's going to be available on the internet for free. You can download it. And so now I have this other audience, right, that's extracting the things that I have
yeah.
written
Yeah.
and is going to be trained on. And so now I have to think about like, well, what does that mean now for my relationship with the internet? I believe that knowledge should be open and out there. And now here's this large language model or multiple kinds that can take my book and
Mhm.
transform it into something else, and I don't really know. What exactly do I do in terms of my agency to make decisions about the language that I put out there? And then kind of like conveying that to my students is like, look, like we're being extracted all the time, and we know there's bias in this. How exactly do we write in a different kind of way,
Yeah.
knowing that we are going to be part of the design of these systems for a while? So that's the question that I'm thinking about. How do I want to be extracted today? If I
Yeah.
if I can't tell you not to extract me, how would I like that to be done?
Yeah, and that's such a resonant question. Like those couple of sentences we were looking at have been so meaningful for me in part because you were just addressing like open access. And I was looking at in another project, indigenous language databases.
Mhm.
And they potentially, as collectively, can have complicated relationships to access because, the sort of ethos of open access feels very empowering and good. You know, it's like information should be free. We should all have access to it. But sometimes they can have, understandably, a historical reaction to, yeah, but that has a bias or biases that you're not acknowledging that may be exploitative because previously they've been exploited by statistics,
Hmm.
right? Learning about them has taken knowledge that was privileged to them and just been spread out to others. And for them, it's, potentially a violation. It's like that was our stuff.
Hmm.
Saying open access can have this kind of colonialism that we don't always acknowledge. At the same time, what you're saying there in that piece where it's like, it's getting slurped up. And so if you're not putting your stuff out there from you, that means what these things, which become the world, what they know about you is not from you.
Hmm.
It puts you in such this rhetorical bind of, it's like, what choices do I make here? It's like I have to tell, as you say, it's like I have to tell the truth. I got to get the truth into the archive. At the
Hmm.
same time, it's like that's maybe in tension with my own feelings of kind of protectionism that are historically rooted.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's something that I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah. I don't, yeah, that was, I was like, and
I don't have an answer to that question.
yeah, yeah. It's just like it's complicated, and it's like they have to make those kinds of other than as you've done. It's like you're pointing out the ground that we are in, right? It's like we're at least aware of the complexities of the situation we're in.
Mhm.
Yeah, it got me thinking too, right? That the weird I made we were talking about we teach in part of our writing program, we have like the standard sort of business writing class or a tech writing class and conversations about do we actually make prompt writing a part of that, right? That seems to be a possible direction that like tech com is taking or professional writing is taking is if there'll now be industries where they'll turn the writing over to generative AI, is it actually what you need a tech writer to do is to write the prompt
Hmm.
that generates the text, right? And it occurred to me that and this piece sort of I think resonates with that, right? In the future, there'll be no writers. Everybody will just be a writing teacher.
Mm.
Right.
In the sense that
Yeah.
that what everyone is now doing is no human will write anymore. We're just going to have to teach things to write. But there's a sense of what you're acknowledging is like that's always like that's right. Like any act of writing itself is just a precursor to teaching someone or something else how
Hmm.
to write. Um, and thinking then about assignment prompts as prompts, right? Like the teacher generates the prompt that then the student, as the generative AI, right? I mean, I think as a lot of us explored, like, why did generative AI become automatically ported into higher ed,
Hmm.
Mm.
right? Like because I think we were already
Mhm.
it does what we've always been doing, I think, and maybe not everybody's always been doing, but I think a certain kind of writing pedagogy that does actually imagine what it's doing. It's prompting its students to generate machine-like responses, right? I think that a lot of people's idea of what first-year writing is supposed to do is to turn them into bots who can generate
Yeah.
serviceable prose for the
Hmm.
next 4 years, right? The inoculation model that sort of circulates around first-year writing.
Hmm.
So it
Yeah.
it turns out it's very easy for something like a ChatGPT to become a problem
Mhm.
because it's following pathways that were already built into the logic of I think a lot of education
Yeah.
Mm.
pedagogy.
Yeah, and I think that's what, yeah, Carmen Kynard kind of gets at that, like you're writing like a robot and you don't realize it until these like generative AI comes onto the scene, right? And becomes part of that. And I guess it kind of opens up for better opportunities to lean into like different linguistic practices that we've kind of been advocating for the
Mhm.
Mhm.
last several years. Um, and I kind of think about that with my own students when I'm teaching them. I think it was actually last spring 2024, that I had a student. She came to visit me in my class or in my office actually, and she said like she's 18 years old, right out of high school, and She's Latina, and she says to me, like, I know I have to write a particular kind of way in college in this class, but at the same time, that's not me. That's not what I want to really do. And I told her, like, I know this can't be the case for every class, but I do think that in my class, like, you should just do it. Like bring in that informal writing, because you're still doing research, you're still doing citations, all of the classic moves that's expected of college writing, but your voice and your style, that's the thing that you can really embrace. And so she understood where I was coming from, but she felt that pull. I'm like, but that academic writing though is what I really still need to learn at the same time. So even when you get the thing that you really wanted, which is what it sounded like to me, it's like, yes, let's go ahead and do that. There is that pull from so much history and so much learning that I have to really kind of still embrace this kind of way of writing. And so I am trying to think about, how do I encourage students to write in a different kind of way, that kind of like shifts our own thinking about what we put out into the world. And I think that can kind of alleviate some anxieties about, am I reading AI generated text or not?
Mm.
Yeah. No, Antonio, it's cool to hear you mention style, because right when this sort of AI sort of became an issue, I was asked I had to teach a class called Writing with Style,
Mhm.
which is historically I've avoided because it used to be called rhetorical grammar. And I think I had all this baggage about, like, oh, I'm gonna have to do Strunk and White, and that's so right? Like I had all this idea, and rhetoric sometimes wants to avoid style because we don't want to, like, I've avoided knowing what a chiasmus was because everyone expected me to know what a chiasmus was.
Yeah.
And I started prepping for the class. I realized that this class wasn't that, right. And I borrowed a lot of material from my colleague Paul Lynch. Is that, weirdly enough, thinking about style and what that means and what that allows students to think about their writing. I actually felt that class became, at least half of the semester unconsciously, my response to
Hmm.
generative AI. That actually thinking about style and the way that the language or terminology of style gives students ways of thinking about their writing, that oftentimes I think in many ways it's also got me to rethink our kind of our own first year writing course.
Hmm.
When I realized how, depending on what that class is doing, how little time they actually talk about writing. What
Hmm.
they're oftentimes talking is about, content delivery or the research part, right? Which is important. What you realize is, like, yeah, but there's no stylistics happening there.
Hmm.
And maybe that's a way to get, it also sort of expand students, um, I don't know, knowledge or even appreciation or even pleasure in the way they think about writing. I mean, one of the things my general refrain now is, like, a student would have to turn over writing to a chatbot. They wouldn't turn over drinking beer to a chatbot, right? Like, I wouldn't have Chat GPT take an edible for me,
No.
because I would rather do that myself, right? So why are the students having, because for a lot of students it's a painful activity that they
Mhm.
take no pleasure in.
Mhm.
So I think, right, that meeting with your student and getting them to think about style they might write in, I
Mhm.
think is also thinking about the actual, you know, the material moment of writing and what that feels like to students, and
Mhm.
why or why not they'd want to avoid that or put it off or give it to somebody else.
Yeah, it makes me think about so many different things. Like, the first, when you talk about style, I was thinking about, there's research, it was published in Written Communication, and I don't know if you saw that. I remember ideas. I'm really good at remembering ideas, but I cannot tell you names or the titles of things. I
Same. Yeah, yeah.
But it was analysis of GPT-3, the linguistic variation of GPT-3. And reading their findings, I took away from is like, wow, this is actually kind of a worse version of standard English. One of the arguments that they make is that if students are kind of like over reliant on this, for example, it's not really going to expand their writing development, their rhetorical awareness, or their linguistic style, because the linguistic variation is down to like nouns and verbs. There, it gives the sense that the answer that I have given you is the answer, and there is no conversation to be had afterwards. You know,
Mm.
or they found that there are no examples here. It just assumes that you know what this complicated term actually is. And so and you probably have heard about this where people like let students compare essays written by ChatGPT or other large language models with a human, and they swear that the AI generated text is really good. But if you really look at it closely, you realize there are no examples. It's just nouns. It gives you a sense that you're not engaged in a conversation.
Mm.
And when students are developing their writing through college, they realize like, oh, I'm part of a larger community, and I'm going to
Mhm.
write in a way where there's an invitation to engage with me, which is
Yeah.
not what you're going to get from large language models, depending, of course, like you said before, on the prompt that you're giving it. But that was really interesting. I was thinking about that when you're talking about style and really how to bring students to understand that what they're getting is even worse than academic writing, even though it looks really good.
Is this the thing I found you posted that as well? Is this the one dense and disconnected analyzing the
Oh
sedimented?
yeah. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think this might be the Kynard, this one when robots
Yes.
come home to roost. Yeah.
Yes, that's the
Just
piece.
to
Hmm.
point folks to those that we're talking about. Yeah, and that notion of it being invitational or conversation is something I've been kind of grappling with recently, that's come up is Plato's screed against writing. And I mean, like I think like all of us, I don't know what my relationship to Plato is like. As I tell my students, I'm like, in most classes, this guy is a hero. For us, he's probably a villain, or at least he did some pretty awful stuff.
Yeah.
But then like, one of his critiques of writing is it's, dumb in the sense of it can't respond to you. It just says the same thing over and over again.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I wonder how he would see the chatbots of now, because they do ostensibly. Now, I suspect he'd be like, at least Plato Socrates would be like, but it's still not real.
Yeah.
I think he'd be horrified,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
like it seems like that critique of, well, it can't talk to you, it's like it kind of can. A little bit it can. It can talk to you the way that I sometimes talk to people when I'm not paying attention to them.
Yeah. No, it's that whole sort of the critique of it's just a stochastic parrot. And I'm like, I'm not convinced I'm not one.
Yeah.
Like there's a weird logic to kind of how it I think what's so compelling about it, maybe, or also horrifying, like sort of uncanny valley, is I don't I I think from a certain standpoint, I'm not a large language model,
Hmm.
which is the sense that I think I too generate language by a complex system of associations. I'm frequently surprised by the last word I say, because the last word I say was shaped not by what I intended to say, but by all the words that I just said.
Yeah, that came out of your
Like,
mouth. You're
right?
probabilistically picking the next word too.
Yes, right. But in a much more probably richly contextual, or maybe not, or itself also a problematic context, right? Like I think what word am I in my identity likely to say next is not an accident, right? That's historically shaped and culturally contingent,
Hmm.
and those kinds of things too. So yeah. Also, I just got like five Plato zingers. Like, here's other things Plato would be uh,
Yeah.
surprised by, and they're all things we like, right? You guys have a democracy. Well, kind of Plato, but yeah, uh-huh.
Well, and
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting because, like, I know that the content generation is what we're always thinking deeply about, both as writing teachers, but just in general. Just to kind of throw out another resource, I was reading Why Machines Learn for the last few weeks, which digs into the math,
mm,
the equations behind uh, uh, large language models and how they've actually trained it. So it's part history, part math book. I don't follow all of the math, even though people swear like it's so elegant, it's very easy to understand it. But I understand the bigger concept about like the probability and statistics and everything. And I sometimes kind of wonder if I try to rethink what it is, and I'm just kind of like making sure that it's not necessarily like content generation, but I am looking at possibilities or
Mhm.
probabilities for my thinking. So not being engaged with the text itself, but thinking about like what are the different directions that I might take my
Mm,
thinking. So I'm not interested in the content because I already know that it's not very good. And but I'm thinking like, how do I think with this? Is this a machine to think with,
mm,
as opposed to focusing so much on the content
Yeah.
that may or not be copied? Like, quite literally take how mathematicians or learning researchers might take it for, which is this is a probability based on that training data. And what does it mean to write in that kind of mode of thinking when I'm engaged with it? There's an article in there somewhere that I've been playing around with, but I'm thinking about like rhetoric, rhetorical choice, and what's the relationship between choice and is there something different if I think more about rhetorical probability or possibilities in my own
Yeah.
writing?
mm,
Yeah, I'm thinking about that Nate Stormer article called Rhetoric by Accident.
Mm.
That he spent a lot of time also like unpacking what accident means. Um,
Mm.
but right, kind of thinking about the what precipitates a rhetorical response.
Hmm.
Um, and at one point, I think later on in the article, uses a couple of pieces wrote by W.E.B. Du Bois to think about what rhetoric by accident looks like. But I think in this, like thinking about the probabilities that emerge.
yeah.
Hmm.
Um, and again, right, I mean, to kind of think about our larger way of thinking, I think what's really, I don't know, compelling or useful about that is it just bypasses the whole metaphysical question of whether or not it's really intelligent or what it is, right? Even the
Mm,
content of it, right? That's not what rhetoric's going to be interested in. Rhetoric's interested in, I'm actually interested in this artifice. And
me
what does that
too.
artifice then allow me to do
To
and
do.
potentially do differently?
Hmm.
Uh, right.
Yeah.
Again, the critique, I think Plato might go, well, is it really intelligent? Like, I don't, Plato, we
Right.
don't like that you miss so many other interesting, important questions, right?
Hmm.
Like, is it really intelligent or not? Like, actually, how many underpaid Kenyans is it taking to keep it from being less toxic, right? That's the more
Yeah.
interesting
Right.
ethical conundrum, right? And if you decided, well, we now know that it's really intelligent, well, that doesn't help me answer any of the questions about.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I think our instinct, right, is that it's actually how does this particular artifice create particular kinds of rhetorical possibilities or probabilities
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
compositional ones.
And
Hmm.
you know what is fascinating about that also is because it's something I've been attempting to approach with students, although class has been suspended because of light snow.
Yeah.
But looking at the difference between treating writing as instrumental and epistemic, right? And there's an interesting potential there for like, I'm sure it's coming where composition programs at the university level just get kind of written out of existence because it's like, well, we don't need that anymore. Students can just fire it off, right? And it's like potentially, but that's treating writing as pure instrument, where it's like, here's what I want you to do, now do it, right? It has no engagement with writing as a mode of thinking,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
It's like we can still use those tools to activate, and this even came up in the writing science book the Schimmel piece where he talks about is writing a way to articulate your ideas or is it a mode that leads to clear thinking, right? And he's like, well, it's both. And he's a
Mhm.
fairly kind of like I don't want to say like he's teaching us like sort of structures and stuff, and he accepts it's like it's both. It's something we do to output ideas. It's something we do to clarify our own thinking and become solid thinkers, right? It kind of reminds me of like the arguments about like, well, nobody has to lift weights. Get a machine to do it. It's like, yeah, but you still do it. because it makes you better, it makes you healthier, it makes you stronger, right? It's like, yeah, sure, I can tell the machine write this for me, but that's not going to engage thought. I mean, it's just at that
Yeah.
point, it's shutting it off.
We had Jeremy, really interesting. We mentioned, I talked about this in a senior seminar. I was introducing them to the concept of transduction as opposed to transfer. I used and I basically pointed out I gave them an analogy, right? That if you want to know the difference between transduction and transfers, actually transfer thinking totally saturates higher ed. The idea, right? If you've ever asked in a math class, when am I ever going to use this? That's transfer thinking. The idea that this discrete skill will then be deployed in another context. But I said, but in athletics, transduction is actually the logic, which is it'd be weird for an athlete to say, Coach, when am I ever going to use jumping jacks in the game?
Yeah.
Right. That's a dumb question because the jumping jacks you're not going to then transfer jumping jacks into a play. It's what jumping jacks have transduced your body, preparing it to do something else. Right. But transfer thinking in particular saturates writing programs, right? I mean, I do you can transfer it in, right? We're literally under, right? I have a brewing conversation with one of my colleagues because I tweeted this out about that literally the debates, and I think they're productive, right? In the field about transfer. There's a sense in which that discussion around transfer is potentially undermining the whole enterprise.
Yeah.
Because if the student already has it and can transfer it in, that's the language we use.
Yeah.
Then I've got it now. I've got it.
Yeah.
And I can now transfer it. Well, if I've already got it, what do I need you for? Right? Well, because what's happening in my class is not transferable. None of this is transferable.
Yeah.
It's maybe transducible, right? That go back to Antonio's, right? This is writing instruction is probable. There's no right. If it's not going to transfer, in which case we now know what writing is, and you're going to get it in these 16 weeks, and you can now bring it with you into your sophomore year. But if actually what we're introducing is compositional probabilities, you might have to write this way. You might have to write another way.
Yeah.
And what we hope is what you actually come from this class is a certain instinct or disposition that can, right? I don't think I'm inoculating them. But that also means that in terms of assessment, I don't really know whether they've gotten it because I can't know yet.
Yeah.
The thing of just a weird little one-line coda to that. I've seen TV ads for institutions that will grant you college credit based on what you've done on your job, right? And I'm like, that's a really interesting way of seeing education as just a check mark. You've done this, therefore you. And it's like, but that you're not coming to school, so that means you're not coming to school to learn. You're coming just to punch a ticket that you've punched elsewhere, you know?
Yeah, I think they use the language of competence. I think you can, it's no, you don't. You already have it, so we'll give you credit for it. What are we?
Right.
What are we doing? What do you think? Yeah, those commercials are stunning to me because just like we don't think college is the same. We have radically different ideas about what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting what you were talking about transduction versus transfer, because I have eaten up the transfer language, but I think probably I don't actually practice that.
I don't think, I think transfer gives us a way of getting a sense of what it is that we do, but I think there's at least for me a risk in the logic of transfer as it's, I think it potentially to go back to ChatGPT, right? It overly nouns what it is that we do.
Yeah.
And we're actually verbing, and verbs don't really, nouns transfer, verbs do something else, right?
Verbs do something else.
Right. So for me, rhetoric for me, like if a student asks, what's the difference between philosophy and rhetoric? Philosophy does nouns and we do verbs.
Well, and that makes me think about like going back to why I say I don't think I actually do that is first, and this is kind of like picking up on what Jeremy was saying, is like this idea that, why is it that like students may use large language models to get assignments done? And I keep thinking about like tasks, like it's a thing that needs to be done. Like you mark it, and then you get your points, and now you can move on to the next thing. But in my own classrooms, I tell my students that, this isn't a boot camp, it's a playground. This is a way for you to really kind of, and I guess this kind of sounds a little idealistic, cultivate your voices and expand the possibilities or the range of ways of writing in this classroom. But for me, you're learning a very specific kind of concept. So like last semester I taught it's called Rhetorics of New Media, but I taught it as a Black Digital Rhetorics course instead. And telling students like we're going to take inspiration from the work of Black rhetoric, of Black digital rhetoric, and note how a lot of that generates and becomes possible because of that lived experience with oppression. Now, that's not the only reason why we have Black rhetorics, because there's celebration at the same time of your culture. But I want you to kind of be thinking about your own lived experience and how does that transform into your own rhetoric. So
Mm.
students were not doing like heavy research papers or anything, but they're thinking about, like, for example, the last assignment, I do like weird assignments. I tell my students I'm the one you come to when you don't want to write an essay because we're doing all types of digital stuff. But I told them, like, let's take inspiration from like fiction writers who create world Bibles, world building Bibles. And we read about Afrofuturism, we read Octavia Butler, we looked at Black Panther, hitting all the pop culture examples. And it's like, okay, what does the future look like? Take this canvas, this digital canvas, create your own world. Like Afrofuturism looks to the past, critiques the past while also thinking about what does the future of Black centered lives or a world that centers Black lives looks like, and then kind of like create your own world. What does that look like for your particular community? And it's not tied to your identity. It could be for gamers. I had a person who was into video games and loves Destiny 2. I
Yeah.
said, what does a conference look like for Destiny 2 gamers in the future? It's not about oppression. It is about like that lived experience, about the desires that you have for a better future. Um, and so, that's why I tell my students is like, this is where you can think about those other possibilities for your writing. It's not a boot camp. It is a place to experiment.
Mm.
And then the last thing is that I've tried to like kind of share that with my graduate students who are TAs. I teach a class called Teaching Writing. And in that class, we had a conversation about why are English teachers kind of so angry about writing sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
It's like the red pen, I'm mostly in like the like Canvas and Blackboard doing grading now, but it's like the red pen, it's like the grammar, the punctuation, the thesis statement, it's got to look this kind of way. And I told my students, like, I tried to do that with college students. My background's in education. I took that classroom management style into my very first year writing class as a master's student, telling students like, don't, why are you drawing? Stop that drawing, like pay attention. Students hated it. They hated me. They said Mr. Byrd is disrespectful. He's
Mm.
always angry. We don't know why he's so mad. And I was like, oh, this is not how you teach college, right?
Mm.
And so I told my graduate students, like, we're not trying to write the best, greatest thing ever in the classes. We are here to learn about writing, to think about writing, to really engage with it in a learning community. So I've tried you know, to be looser, to like enjoy the ride that students bring with their language, as opposed to being like, you need to know your subject verb agreement. So that's something I've been thinking about is just like enjoy this moment, this playground. That's what you're really trying to do. And I think that's what I think about when I heard you say transduction. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe that's what I'm trying to do with my students.
Yeah. I
Mm.
yeah. Boy, and to go, I had lots to think about there. What really got me excited too is you're zeroing in on the use of the word task,
Hmm.
Yeah,
because that's
that's
what
for us.
Turkers do. They're called HITs, human
Hmm.
intelligence tasks.
Hmm.
And so the reduction of everything to a task has been something that what we've been thinking through. Um, and what we've started to think about is zeroing in less on the task, but on the taskscape. Like what's the artifice in which certain tasks take place, right?
Yeah.
So you're switching from the analogy of boot camp to playground, right?
Hmm.
Refigures those tasks, right?
Hmm.
And so um,
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well, and there's so much built in there. In fact, I kind of wanted to ask a follow-up question that
Yeah.
I feel I have to sort of about like assessment, right? Because that always comes up because
Hmm.
so much of, and Nathaniel was alluding to this earlier, where it's like, well, yeah, LLMs are doing what we asked them to, and we've structured the university
Hmm.
to, to generate that because like a lot of our, even things like, as you were just talking about, like focusing on formal features, it's like, why do we do that? In part because it scales and it gives us defensible, well, you got a B and here's why, and this B is comparable to a B you got in Spanish and math because it suggests a certain level. It's like a lot of those things are there because it's like, well, we need to be able to cross compare, we need to be able to handle students at scale, right? And
Hmm.
so it's like a lot of those structures have been built and they're potentially in tension with, you know, some things perhaps we want to do as educators. What do
Hmm.
you do with like assessment if the focus is this is a playground, not a boot camp?
Hmm.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, so in the last couple of years, I started to use self-assessments with my students. And part of it came out of finding labor-based contract grades.
Mhm.
They really weren't helping me get at what students were really learning. And I realized this during the pandemic. In the summer of 2020, I was teaching our second semester, first year writing class, which is in research methods. And I had a student who was a nurse. She was actually in a surgery center. I remember she told me that she could not focus because she had COVID, and she said anytime she looked at a screen, she would feel nauseous, like she was going to throw up, and
Mm.
she could not do her annotated bibliography. And I remember meeting with her and just like, because I was intent on getting people to graduate. So I was just throwing out all of these things that were in the contract so that we could really just focus on writing that final research article
Mhm.
that was due at the end of the summer. And I was really more engaged with responding to students in as a conversation about their writing as opposed to using rubrics. I felt like the labor-based contract grades that I created or the contracts I created, I felt like they were tasks to check off.
Yeah.
And so I
yeah,
wanted to kind of like get away even from that and get even further away from grades
Wow.
and thinking more about the self-assessment. So I give them a list of reflective questions at the end of each unit. And it's really based on how did you learn in community with each other? You have this evidence of peers responding to your work. You are responding to them. I'm engaged with you. Look back on that and think about what are you learning? What's going on there about writing from this socio-cultural engagement with other people? And then the biggest thing was just like that student who ran into COVID, I was kind of like asking students, kind of tell me what prevented you from learning in our community. And I wasn't trying to ask them for trauma. I kind of set up the class in a way that we can be vulnerable, but without the judgment, but as a way to give grace and patience. What did you run into? Because students would often tell me, like, I can't do XYZ because, this thing happened at my house, or I actually had an ex-boyfriend who was stalking me. A student had told me
Yeah. Right.
before the pandemic. And it was a way to give grace and patience to say, hey, you're great at what you're doing, if not for the ex-boyfriend who's stalking you. Give yourself grace and patience for why that is really disruptive to your own learning. And then students do that reflection on their writing, and then they end with proposing their own grade. And I try to tell them, like, we're trying to focus just on the learning and what you take away from it, but not the grade. The
Mhm.
grade doesn't really, the grade is kind of like an administrative thing that we have to like fulfill for the university. But I really do believe that the learning is happening here in your self-assessment and our engagement in community with each other. So that's what I do and take my approach in a playground type of way is how do you feel about the playground that you played in? Who did you engage with?
Have you had any institutional resistance or anything? Or?
I haven't. The our English department, our program, we um, were really respectful of everyone's approach to doing assessment.
Mhm.
So no one has really told me like, why are these grades so high?
Mhm.
Usually students are very honest because the work is there. You can't
Mhm.
you can't say you get an A and it's like, well, you didn't do anything for the entire.
Yeah.
If anything, students are a little harder on themselves.
Mm.
And that's where that grace and patience come in. It's like, but the work is really good. So I haven't received any pushback from the university. In our program, the biggest thing that folks are concerned about is the signature assignments that are used for program assessment.
Yeah.
And so that has to be there at the end of each semester because that's how we know how students are actually writing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and particularly as kind of its affiliation or its shaping by the pandemic, because there was this kind of, at least where I was, this sort of like, let's all give each other a break for a little bit here, right?
Mhm.
It's like we're dealing with enough, but then, and maybe this is just internal, but it's like it felt like as that wrapped up, there was at least sort of like a back to business kind of, it's
Yeah.
like, well, things are now back to normal. There was almost potentially like a backlash where it's like, well, now we need to
Uh-huh.
get back on the ball. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Time to be cruel again, guys.
Time to be real, So
Uh-huh.
it was,
Well, and cognizant that we've got nine minutes left on the clock, and didn't quite get to the other piece, which is not a problem at all. But one of the things that is of interest to us that you were, I think, getting at, right? That the need to attend to what's compelling about that, you know, uh, uh, students learning to become robots because of the way that they're trying to prove that they aren't robots, right? This interesting tension is, and that our instinct to look at the artifice, I think, gets us to think about different kinds of questions, which is partially what you're getting at, Antonio. I think is really interesting, and Jeremy's even follow-up question, right? That even the pressure to assess, right? The need to give grades, the need to give grades on a particular semester cycle,
Mhm.
right? Those are all things that actually are part of the artifice that shapes how students write. Um, and so, thinking about other ways to think through the kinds of choices that we make, right? That there's the choice of what kinds of assignments do I give to students? What what do I what do I tell my students I think writing is or what writing does?
Mhm.
But then also these institutional, right? Like what we kind of picked up looking at Mechanical Turks is how much of the output of those hits is shaped by the incentive mechanism, right? How they're paid, how
Mhm.
that pay is delivered, how
yeah.
they're able to communicate or not communicate with each other, right? What are labor relations like on this platform? Um, and so I think there's compelling ways in which, as three teachers of writing, think about all these really interesting theoretical, rhetorical, historical concepts,
Mhm.
right? Very within 45 minutes, we're going to have to start talking about how that gets graded and when those grades get turned in, because that's part and parcel of our thinking about writing is the task we're given
Yeah.
right, our human intelligence tasks of we now have to rate our Turkers, our students, right? Did they deliver what we asked them to deliver,
Mhm.
and do they then subsequently get paid or not, right? Turkers don't get paid if the thing they turn in is rejected,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so it's really interesting that comes up towards the end of that article, right? Gets us thinking about that, right? That also what is shaping this student writing like a robot isn't the prompt, right? It's actually the fact that the teacher's going to grade them, and
Mhm.
that'll be based on a percentage of how human they think the writing is. And we might, I think, in the humanities overly fixate on what sounds like a human, but what gets missed there is why do you need to grade what they turned in at all?
Right.
Right? Why can't it be then a subsequent conversation about the self-assessment that the student does, right? Yeah. So
Yeah. Well, I think about like the main process is
Mm.
the thinking behind the thing itself and not the product. I mean, I like you said, I know that in some cases, like in the examples with Mechanical Turks, like the product is the thing, right? You need that particular artifact that needs to be worked on. And then for us thinking about what is the process, the choices that you actually make, in response to all of these other things that are happening around you, your embodiment, your emotions, the task that's actually given to you. And that probably matters more than anything else compared to that final product. I mean, that's why I took away points from all of the assignments other than that final self-assessment, because the points don't really matter. And that's not why you're spending thousands of dollars for coming to this school. Is
Right, right.
to
That's a
get
good argument.
it's kind of like doing like a mindset shift as much as possible about what is it that you really value, and what is it that you find to be most important. Um, in that, I guess, like in that relationship with the student in the content that you're actually teaching, because I think in terms of those relationships with students, and I think about what is it that I really value the most out of these 16 weeks that we really have together,
Yeah.
and how is that going to make me a happier person and a happier teacher
Yeah.
overall? Are some of the things that I think about when it comes to like that final product, or looking at that final thing. And I think that's the reason why I don't use like an AI detector. I already know that they're not very good, but I think it's another reason is that authentic connection with the student. Even if they somehow have used AI to create that essay, that does not remove the relationship, because then that's when the email comes. That's when let's sit down and talk about this,
Yeah.
because there's something going on here. And, I'm going to set the task you completed to the side, and let's talk to each other.
Mm.
Yeah. No,
So,
I think you're right there. It's revealing, I think, how quickly when things start to change. And again, this is not, but my sense is right that the university as a whole, its instinct is always discipline and punish. Like
Mm.
how do I detect it? Well, to make that the first question you ask for me already reveals quite a bit, which is what do you think your job as a teacher is
yeah,
to detect students who have like I mean, there's certain sense in which I may be too willy-nilly, right? My general response, this is a non-compulsory educational experience. I'm not catching you getting away with anything. You don't have to, right? Like you paid the thousand. It's unclear to me what I'm enforcing if
mhm,
I decide. But for me, the enforcing it immediately, potentially, or for me, it immediately ruins the relationship you have with a student. The
yeah,
if you want to not teach your students, develop an antagonistic relationship with them,
yeah, yeah,
right? And we have so many other, I have instructors who will email me saying, I think I have a student who's plagiarized. And I'm like, you have so many other tools at your disposal other than catching them,
yeah,
which is, this sounds like it was written by a robot. How do I prove it was written by a robot? You don't need to. You can email the student and say, it sounds like a robot wrote this. And
yeah,
stylistically, I didn't ask you to turn in something that sounds like a robot. How
yeah,
could we make this sound like a robot didn't write it, right?
yeah.
Instead of punishing you for not doing the assignment, I could teach you writing. That could be what I do, right? That I think that back to basics, at least for me, is we could still talk about this as writing.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I talk about. I think it was last year, maybe in 2023, I had a teaching assistant who was also in my teaching writing class, and he sent me a literacy narrative and said, I think this was written by AI. Like I even, put in the prompt. And so I read through that draft that the student had turned in, and I was like, well, there's no specific details at all in this narrative. So maybe. But so I told him that exact same thing. Like I think how I would respond, and this is my advice to the student, is tell the student, like, look, this writing, it's not good writing. There's nothing specific about your story. You don't even have to say, I think this was written by AI. If the student thinks this paper is so good, I'm gonna give it to my professor and I read it. I'm gonna tell you exactly what I think about the writing.
Yeah.
It that you should go back and rewrite this.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
assume, just I think a good pedagogical stance, assume it's all authentic and still go from there.
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
if you get your jollies on policing students, you still get that. It's
yeah,
just more subtle. But right, I think you can always just assume it's an authentic piece of writing and then teach writing.
yeah.
Well, and that's, I compel my students at different junctures to use AI because, it's there. And I tell them, like, I don't think any of you are cheaters, but we're going to talk about different uses of AI and
Mm,
potentially the stakes involved there. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend my time trying to quixotically suss out. It's like, well, did you? I mean, I guarantee there's some things that I'm reading of theirs that it's like, I guarantee they just threw this into
mhm,
ChatGPT. But then that also kind of raises the question for me. It's like, well, what am I asking from them to do? If it's like, if you can,
mhm.
it's almost like I'm doing the same thing. If it's like I'm giving them a perfunctory assignment, if they're giving me a perfunctory response. So it's like, what am I actually asking them to do here with this?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I do have students in the notice or the notion of the task mindset, because I'm probably not as I probably don't leave quite as much in the students' hands. And sometimes when I do, and this is probably just my frame of reception, but it's like I will have students who will be like, just tell me what you want so I can check this off my list, man. It's like, I'm busy and I've got stuff to do in a life. And if I'm like, well, you can take, you can go a lot of different directions with this. They're like, just tell me what you want. I
Yeah.
get it. I get it. We all are trying to just clear that to-do list. We're all being compelled by the human intelligence task set before us.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's a particular challenge if you're teaching writing also with all the if also teaching writing rhetorically. Which like I'll tell my students, okay, let's say I give you a really particular, write a joke, write a knock knock joke.
Mhm.
Well, if you get up Saturday and tell it and everybody laughs, it's funny. And then you get up Friday and tell it and no one laughs, it's not funny. The joke is ontologically funny and not funny.
Mhm. Yeah.
So then the students are like, well, see, that's even so. Even if you give us a demonstrative task, even the task of evaluating it is like, listen, I liked it, so cool. But you need to understand, good writing is not so. I can't tell you
Right.
now and forever that this is good writing. It's writing is a
It's not
relationship with
essential.
the
It's not
reader.
in the document. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that I
Yeah,
still
that
have questions. The students would be like, "No, the joke's not funny." I'm like, "But a bunch of people, even
Yeah.
when they know I'm asking them a trick question, they still feel compelled to answer it yes or no." I'm like,
that's the
guys, who
that's
hurt you?
the Jerry Seinfeld documentary, right? Where literally they ask Jerry if the joke's funny. He's like, well, does the audience laugh at it? And they ask the other guy, and he's like, I'm a professional comedian. I know this joke is funny. Very different groundings
Mhm.
of effect. And I was like, I can see validity in both of them.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say, I'm conscious of the time. One thing I was thinking about is going back to that idea about like why teachers can be really unhappy, and that surveillance pedagogy brings about that unhappiness. So kind of like with you, Jeremy, I do tell my students like, I teach them about generative AI. I have like a video for my online students. And I tell them like these are the ways that you might want to think about it. Um, and then that kind of like makes me a little bit happier because then there is that question that comes in the self-assessment. How did you use generative
Right.
artificial intelligence? I give them the option sometimes. I tell them here's a way for you to use AI without sucking up energy, like how you can put it on your own computer, and that mitigates the problem of these data centers that are just
Oh,
like
wow.
mini cities.
Yeah.
But then I asked them like, how did you use generative AI? And most of the students don't use it. Even
Mm.
if I give them the option, and then I, open up that transparency. We're leading with our values. Most students don't really use it. The ones who do, they say it's more for brainstorming. I
Yeah.
didn't use this for create my own content. Another student for peer review said, because they had an option to use it for peer review, but they had to use, a human being's response. And I remember a student said, like, you and my peer did a great job. Frankly, I really don't like AI and I don't really need it. So I did a survey for my university, got 575 responses from students. And so I'm still looking through it. But the students are so critical and so aware of
Mm,
the AI. From what I can tell from their responses, I'll do interviews with them later on as a follow-up. But in other words, we should trust our students a bit more.
Yeah.
yeah,
They're not like unaware. They know
right.
about AI and they know very much what they want from their education. So I'll say that
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
one of my final
No,
notes.
yeah, I think that's, yeah. Yeah, I was just going to try to rephrase it. I was going to say, yes, that's
yeah,
yes.
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, well, thanks, Antonio. This has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
As usual, we barely touched upon the thing we asked you to look at, the writing like a robot piece. This is what happens. Our conversations always shoot off in these different directions. This is why we've been rewriting this piece every time. Every week we have to rewrite this piece.
Hmm. Yeah, it's now just a MacGuffin at this point for to keep generating episodes of this show. It's what's Twin Peaks that's finding out who killed Laura Palmer. We don't ever want to know because the
Yeah.
show gets really bad once you find out who did it.
We're just gonna have to, ask AI to write this and then just explain why that's okay. That will be our task. Is here's why that's legitimate.
And then scrub all these episodes.
No, we have to leave them because it's proving it, right? That's our
That's true.
evidence. Is see,
Yeah,
this is
That's
okay
true.
that we did it. This is
yeah.
actually sophisticated. It's not our inability to to get across the line.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think yeah, we want to wrap up. We want to, of course, respect our guests' time. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was fantastic. I made a note to those pieces just so I can add those to the notes so
Yeah.
that we can
Yeah.
reference those other things. Thank you so much, Antonio. Athena, do we have anything else? Oh, we always ask, is there anything you want to plug? You
Oh
mentioned you
yeah,
have a book.
plugs.
You have a book that's finishing up.
Oh, for me, if I have any,
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
if I have any plugs, I don't. Um, no, I guess there
Other
is.
than the book?
Well, the book is being copy edited, so you should definitely look out for that. I was
What's
told
the what's
the
the name?
it's from pipelines to Black tech ecosystems. How Black people find liberation through computer code boot camps.
Oh wow.
So that would be published through the WAC clearinghouse. So and right now it's going through copy edits. So I anticipate that being out later on this year. And then I also did recently publish a short piece in college English. For the last a few years, I've been working with a church that I'm a member of now, and thinking about critical race theory, DEI. They are a church that's really active in the community. They're a reconciling church, and so there is a justice orientation around them. But at the same time, they are a majority white church. And so the question is really is about how exactly do you kind of help a majority white church kind of think deeply and thoughtfully about race and racism? And how do you kind of think about that rhetorically? So that is in the latest issue of College English, a special issue on critical race theory.
Awesome.
Is this one's at Turning Theory into Faithful Community Engagement?
Yes. Yes, that's the
Great.
piece. Mhm.
Excellent. Yeah, we're a legit operation, and you know that because we have plugs at the end.
Well, we want to allow guests to share, I mean, the exciting stuff they're working on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Well,
why we
thank you so
that's why we
much.
talk to folks. It's because they are doing all these things that, that we're not doing that are important.
Okay.
All
Well,
right. I guess that
we'll
wraps it up, and we'll
yeah.
we'll look forward to episode 94.
Yes, sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.